Welcome back to English BookCast, everybody.
Glad to be back.
So today
Yeah.
we're gonna
we're gonna do some.
we're gonna take a really interesting turn, right?
Yeah.
We're all about those deep dives into really great works of literature, but today we're looking at something a little bit different.
Yeah.
But pretty fascinating. We're looking at the mind of Isaac Newton,
Right.
but not his scientific mind,
Right.
so much as his historical one.
Well, sort of historical and scientific, right?
Right. And we're going to be looking at his Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended.
Yeah. Published posthumously.
Published posthumously, right.
But it gives a really fascinating look into his thinking.
I think one of the things that's so cool about this is, he's tired of other studies and decides to just, recalculate the dates of ancient history.
Yeah.
So, if you need some inspiration for your hobbies this weekend,
Right.
this is a great one.
Exactly.
And of course, we're looking at excerpts of Newton's actual work.
Right.
Right. I mean, why mess with a good thing?
Right.
Go straight to the source.
Right. Exactly.
And this deep dive, I think, is going to have a lot of those what moments. So as you're listening, just be prepared to have your mind blown a few times as we kind of unpack some of the things that he's looking at. So
if we take a look at the dedication to the Queen, that opens the work.
Yeah.
What are your initial thoughts on that?
I mean, the respect, right?
Yeah.
Like the respect that he gives to the Queen.
Right.
I think is indicative of just how much
Patronage was important.
Yeah, patronage was important. I mean, it's not like today where you can just, do a Kickstarter or a Patreon or whatever.
Yeah.
You needed the Queen.
You needed a patron
to like your stuff.
Yes.
And of course he points out that she's really interested in the education of the royal issue.
Yes. Yes.
Which is a very interesting way to put that.
Royal progeny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that she really wants, for her children to understand truth.
Yes.
Which I'm sure we can all relate to, right?
Yes.
We want our children to understand truth.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's a big part of this. And then you get to this idea of Newton saying, oh yeah, this was just something I did in my spare time after my other studies.
Well, I mean, when you think about Principia Mathematica, right?
Yeah.
That's some pretty heavy lifting.
Yeah. So this was his evening relaxing activity was to rewrite the entire chronology of the ancient world.
It really gives you a sense of the scope of his mind.
But what I also find interesting is that he does say, hey, look, I'm using established authorities and, proofs as much as I can. He recognizes the limitations of a lot of the stuff.
Exactly. And he doesn't pretend to any kind of omniscience.
Yeah, he's not.
He's very careful and very cautious.
Yeah, I found this date and it's 100% correct.
Right.
It's much more of a
humble approach. Yeah.
Definitely.
And he does point out, too, that even within this chronology, he's going to be kind of interjecting some principles of virtue and humanity, which is so fascinating. I love that.
Well, it reminds you that history is not just a list of dates and kings. It's really about, the human story.
The human story.
Yeah.
And he's very clear that that's part of what he wants to do.
Exactly.
Good.
Well, let's get into the meat of his work.
Okay.
What did he see wrong with the existing chronologies?
So one of his main points right off the bat is that he's looking at the chronology based on the reigns of the Spartan kings.
Okay.
Right. And he's saying there's no way that 17 kings had an average reign of 36 and a half years.
Right.
It's just not.
Doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Statistically, it's just not possible.
Right. And so he's saying that he thinks that, a more likely reign length is going to be, in the 18 to 20 year range.
Right. Much more reasonable.
Yeah. So he adjusts.
So using that, he adjusts the timeline for the return of the Heraclidae to about 340 years before the Battle of Thermopylae.
Right.
And then that, of course, has a domino effect, right?
Of course. Yeah.
Because if that's 340 years, then he's saying, okay, well, the Trojan War would have been 80 years before that.
Right.
The Argonautic expedition, which is one of those classic.
Yeah, Jason and the Argonauts.
Yeah, one generation before the Trojan War. And then the wars of Sesostris and the death of Ino, which is Cadmus's daughter, one generation before the Argonautic expedition. So he's really taking that initial anchor point
and then restructuring everything.
Yeah.
And so what was his, like, overall goal? Like, why was he doing this?
His goal, pretty lofty, was
to create a chronology that was in line with, the course of nature, as he puts it. And by that, he means
reasonable lifespans. Yeah. Reasonable lengths of reigns.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
He also wanted it to, agree with astronomy.
Right.
Secret history, he calls it.
Right, which would be the Bible, basically.
Yeah. And this was something that, like, even Plutarch back in the day was like, guys, there's this chronology stuff.
It's not working.
It's a little wonky.
Yeah, yeah.
So he's really trying to make this...
a grand synthesis.
Yeah.
A grand synthesis.
But, and this is important, like, he's not saying this is perfect.
Right.
He's saying, like, look, I'm allowing for, like, 5 to 10...
margin of error.
Maybe even 20 years of margin of error. So it's not like he's saying, oh, I found the perfect, like...
the exact dates.
Yeah. This is 100%, lock it in. So
early European chronology,
yeah, he
has some problems with that. What were those?
Well, yeah, so he points out that there's really no good European chronology before the rise of the Persian Empire.
Right.
Like, if you're going before that, it's
and
all...
kind of conjecture. Yeah. Guesswork.
Right.
Yeah.
And so he uses the example of this guy, Acusilaus, who was like an early Greek writer, and said that this guy, Pharonius, was as old as Ogyges and his flood.
Okay.
And this was a flood, like, the flood.
Right.
So he's saying that flood happened 1,020 years before the first Olympiad.
Yeah.
Which Newton calculates to be, like, over 680 years too old.
Right. So it's way too far back.
Yeah. And he points out, like, one of the ways that they did this was like, hey, let's
add a few hundred years to each king's reign.
Yeah, let's make these kings' reigns super long.
Right.
And that's how we can push it back.
Right.
And he also points out a really cool little thing from Plutarch.
Yeah.
Who noted that early philosophers expressed themselves in verse like Orpheus and Hesiod.
Yeah.
But later historians and astronomers used prose.
So the shift from poetry to prose.
Yeah. So just a cool little thing to kind of think about, like, how did they actually write this stuff down?
Right.
What was...
So let's talk about the founding of Carthage.
Okay.
What did he find in this research?
So this gets really fascinating because he's talking about how, after the Romans conquered Carthage, they got their hands on all these Carthaginian archives.
Right.
So Appian...
who wrote about the Punic Wars?
Right. The Punic Wars said that Carthage existed for 700 years.
Okay.
But then you have Silenus, who said that Alyssa, who's, Dido, founded Carthage in the 16th year of her brother Pygmalion's reign in Tyre.
Okay.
And was destroyed 737 years later. So we have a pretty good timeline here.
We do.
But the conflict comes in when you start to look at, like, Virgil and Servius.
Okay.
Right. And they're saying, hey, Teucer.
Yeah.
From the Trojan War.
Yeah.
He arrived in Cyprus from the besieged city.
Right.
During, like, Dido's time.
Okay.
Before Pygmalion's reign.
So this means that the Trojan War would have had to have happened much later than traditional chronologies suggest.
So if that's true, right?
Yeah.
Then and if the Romans during the time of Augustus were going by these Carthaginian, Cypriot, and Tyrian records, and not the artificial chronology of Eratosthenes, that would mean that Troy was destroyed about 76 years after the death of Solomon.
Wow. Okay.
So think about that for a second. Like,
that's a huge difference.
Right.
Yeah.
So really cool stuff. Okay, let's talk about...
So astronomical alignments.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how he actually used the stars to figure out his chronology.
So this is where I think it's so cool that he was a scientist.
Right.
And he's using astronomy in his historical analysis, which is really neat. So he's talking about Meton and Euctemon, who were astronomers. And they recorded the timing of the summer solstice. Specifically in the year 316 of Nabonassar, who was the Babylonian king, shortly before the Peloponnesian War.
Right.
And they placed this solstice in the 8th degree of Cancer.
Okay.
Well, according to Newton, that was at least 7 degrees behind where it should have been.
Right. So that means the precession of the equinoxes is coming into play here.
So explain that.
Okay, so Because the Earth wobbles on its axis, the position of the equinoxes and solstices actually shifts westward along what's called the ecliptic.
Okay.
About 1 degree every 72 years.
So it's like a slow clock.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a very slow clock, but it's a clock nonetheless.
Yeah. So a 7-degree difference would be 504 years.
Right.
Because 7 times 72 is 504.
Yep.
Yeah. So if you count back from 3 Hixingtera of Nabonassar,
right,
504 years,
you end up at a date that's about 44 years after the death of Solomon.
Right.
And that would be when the Argonautic expedition occurred, at least according to this astronomical evidence.
Right. So he's saying, like, the Earth's wobble can help us figure out the date of this ancient expedition.
Yeah.
And he brings in
Achilles Tatius.
Yeah.
What does he say about that?
So Achilles Tatius said that different astronomers back in the day placed the summer solstice in different spots within Cancer.
Right.
Some said 8th degree.
Yeah.
Some said 12th. Some said 15th.
Yeah, okay.
And so Newton is saying, okay, well, my calculation, which puts it at 44 years after Solomon's death, because of the 7-degree difference, lines up with one of these ancient observations. And so he concludes, like, look, the Argonautic expedition happened after Solomon died.
Yeah.
Probably around 43 years after.
Yeah.
Based on this astronomical.
Yeah. That's pretty cool, right?
Yeah. So how does he connect all of that to the Trojan War and Amenophis?
Okay.
Or, Memnon.
Okay.
Same dude.
Right.
So he's saying, look, the Trojan War, 1 generation after the Argonautic expedition.
Right.
And then he brings in this thing about Amenophis, who was the king of Egypt, and supposedly reigned during the Trojan War.
Right.
And he's saying, hey, Amenophis was the son of Priam's elder brother Tithonus.
Okay.
So we have some genealogical links going on here.
We do.
So he's saying that Amenophis would have been the same age as Priam's, older sons, right?
Okay, yeah.
And would have been in Susa with his army during that last year of the Trojan War. And then when the war was over, he would have gone back to Egypt, set up all these great monuments, and died somewhere around 90, 95 years after Solomon died.
Okay.
And then he goes on to say that he thinks Amenophis was probably the one who established the 365-day year in Egypt that began at the vernal equinox.
Right.
So
that's how he accounts for the monuments.
Yeah. What about Phoenician connections?
Right. What did he discover there?
So this is also really cool. Because he's talking about maybe an earlier Tyrian Hercules.
Okay.
Who would have been involved in Red Sea trade back during the time of David or Solomon.
Okay.
And then he brings in Tatian.
Okay.
Who reported on 3 Phoenician historians.
Okay.
Theodotus, Hypsicrates, and Mochus.
Okay.
And their histories, once they were translated into Greek, they mentioned the abduction of Europa.
Right.
Menelaus' voyage to Phoenicia.
Okay.
And the alliance between Solomon and Hiram, where Hiram gives Solomon, his daughter, and all that timber for the temple in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And he points out that Josephus and Menander of Pergamum both agree on this stuff.
Right.
Because they were using the Tyrian annals to write their stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So it's not like...
they had good sources.
Yeah. They're just making it up.
Right.
And so those Tyrian annals say that Solomon's temple was founded in the 11th year of King Hiram.
Right. So this would mean that Europa's abduction and Cadmus's arrival in Greece happened during the reign of these Tyrian kings.
So no earlier than Abibalus, who was a contemporary of David.
Okay.
And then he says that Menelaus's voyage probably happened after the Trojan War.
Okay.
So he gives a timeline where Solomon reigned between the abduction of Europa and the abduction of Helen.
Okay.
Europa and Cadmus flourished during David's time.
Okay.
Minos, who's Europa's son, flourished during the time of Solomon and Rehoboam.
Okay.
And then you have the subsequent generations of, Minos' children and grandchildren. Right. Which would put Idomeneus at the Trojan War.
Right.
So all these generations kind of linking it all together.
Okay.
He also says that Hiram succeeded Abibalus in the 23rd year of David.
Right.
And that Abybulus probably founded Tyre about 16, 18 years before that, after Sidon was captured by the Philistines. And Olympus, Cadmus, and Europa all fled to Tyre. So basically he's saying, look, all this stuff happened during David's time. Abybulus, Olympus, Cadmus, Europa, they all fled in like the 16th year of David's reign.
So pushing that Argonautic expedition way back.
Yeah, about 300 years later than the Greeks said it was.
Okay. All right. So what about the founding of Syracuse?
Okay.
Where did he go with that?
So he talks about Lamus leading a Megarian colony to Sicily about the same time as the Argonautic expedition. And then settled in Trutellum. And then Leontini. Lamus died in Thapsus, which is near Syracuse. And then they were invited by Hyblon to Megara in Sicily, where they lasted for about 245 years. Before being expelled by Gelo, who is the king of Sicily.
So he uses Gelo to kind of like trace back.
So Gelo flourished about 78 years before the end of the Peloponnesian War. So if you count backwards from the end of the Peloponnesian War, 78 years to Gelo, and then add 245 years that the colony was in Sicily, and then another 12 years for Lamus for his initial stuff.
You get a date about 335 years before the end of the Peloponnesian War, or about the 10th Olympiad. And he allows like 20, 30 years.
Margin of error.
Margin of error. But he does point out that Eusebius and a bunch of others put it around this time as well. So
it's not just him.
And then he goes on to say that all those colonies that were sent to Italy and Sicily from Greece led to the area being called Magna Graecia.
The Great Greece.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about the Kingdom of Macedon. How does that fit into all this?
So the traditional story is that the Macedonian kingdom was founded by Caranus and Perdiccas, who had fled Argos during the reign of Phidon. Phidon was a descendant of Temenus. And so he kind of recounts like how Temenus was part of the Heraclidae and how Argos was divided. But then Phidon came along and like reunited it all. And got all powerful in the Peloponnese. He even standardized weights and measures and minted silver. And presided over the Olympic Games until he was subdued by the Eleans and the Spartans.
So pretty big deal.
So the question is, was Perdiccas the first king of Macedon, or was it Caranus? Because they're conflicting accounts. So Herodotus said Perdiccas. But Livy Pausanias said Caranus. Justin said Perdiccas succeeded Caranus. And Solinus said Perdiccas was the first to be called king. So what does Newton do? He says, well, they were probably contemporaries. And both fled Argos. They probably set up little tiny kingdoms. In Macedon. And then Caranus died, and then Perdiccas was like,
I'll take over.
Mine now. And so he goes on to list the kings after Perdiccas, all the way to Alexander, who was a contemporary of Xerxes. And he points out, like, the traditional way to do this is to, like, give each king a really long reign. And then that would push Phidon and Caranus way back before, like, the Olympics. But he's saying, no, it's probably later around, like, the 46th, 47th Olympiad. Because, 18 to 20 year reigns. He also uses the example of Leosides, who was Phaedon's son, and Megacles, who was Alcmaeon's son, who were both contemporaries and both courted. Agarista, who was Glycines of Sicyon's daughter. And that was around that time. So, speaking of, big rulers.
Let's talk about Cyrus the Great. How does he fit into all this?
So, according to Ptolemy's canon, Cyrus took Babylon 9 years before he died, which was the second year of the 60th Olympiad, or Nebuchadnezzar 209. And he took Sardis shortly before that, in the first year of the 59th Olympiad. Now, Croesus was king of Sardis for 14 years. And his reign started in the third year of the 55th Olympiad.
So he's setting the stage for, like, this whole period.
So we have to talk about Solon.
Right.
Solon made his laws in Athens. Right. And then bound all the citizens to follow them.
Okay.
Until he got back.
Right.
From the travels, which was supposed to be 10 years.
Yeah.
So he goes to Egypt.
Right. Host speaker.